Hello, this is Liam, nDreams CDO, and I want to talk to you about making a game. And why do I want to do that? Well, making games is something that we're all doing together, right? So whether you're working as a game developer, or you're in finance, or you're in publishing, or you're in IT, it doesn't matter. We are making a game together, or we are making many games together. I think it's important, if you haven't come from the games industry and you haven't done this before, that you understand it's a lot more difficult than you might think. You might have no idea, right? But I can tell you, having made games and worked with a lot of teams over the years and worked inside and outside of the games industry, that making games is probably the most complicated and complex thing that I have ever done. Now, I've worked with the Foreign Office, with Hewlett-Packard, BT, BP. I've been a teacher, I've been a trainer, I've been a knowledge management expert, an e-learning consultant. I've been a producer in the games industry. I've been a dev director. I've been a chief of staff. I've been a VP of production, blah, blah, blah. I've done a lot inside and outside. And I can tell you now, in all of my experience, even working with life science and places like Pfizer and AstraZeneca as a program manager, by far making a game is the most complicated thing you can do, in my experience. And I think it's very important that we go over that and we understand that together, because if you don't, you can start making a whole bunch of assumptions about the kind of problems that are being faced that you don't know about, or the kind of reactions that you're getting when you're approaching, say, a game developer or a studio head or something. Now, in no way, shape and form is this supposed to be defensive or protective of games makers. What this is hopefully doing is giving you an idea of how best to approach the situation and the people, etc., how best to understand this. So let me start by saying we're all in this together and always will be. And we need the support. For people making games, they need the support of the teams around them, or they can't do their job properly. You know, you really are the lubricators. You really are there to make things better for the rest of us, because we are all one team and we all contribute. So let's just take a quick look. There is a lot of history around making games, and a lot of the 1970s, when it all kind of sort of kicked off and became a little bit of a growing business, right? It was the advent of personal computers and role-playing games and things like that, like Dungeons and Dragons. So Apple appears. This could quite easily be Microsoft. It could quite easily be a games company. But let's say Apple. Apple makes the Macintosh. 1976. The people making Apple are in a garage. There's two of them working together, right? If this was Microsoft, it would be Bill Gates in a garage. There are a lot of people who could make a success in a garage, and there was only a couple of them. And the same goes for making games. It was 1, 2, 3 people sat in rooms together making games, and they could chuck out 4 games a year. There are people that would give talks these days on games conferences who will tell you they were knocking out a game once every month or a few months, right? There wasn't a lot to it. It was quite easy. Well, it was relatively easy. But if you look at it now, I mean, look at Apple now, right? Apple's pretty big. They don't just make games. They do something huge, just like Microsoft does, just like so many of the other companies do. But the same has happened with games companies, and the same has happened with making a game. You can't make a game anymore with 1, 2, or 3 people that is comparable to the best games out there. And you used to be able to. Now you can't. You can still put games out if there's 1, 2, or 3 of you, right? You can still do that, but it's going to be a lot harder, and they're not going to be these, what are called, these triple A games, as they call them, which are the massive cinematic quality games. And if you look at a report that's just come out at the time of recording this, it's been pretty much publicized the last few days. You have got these huge high quality, like Hollywood film quality games with hundreds of minutes, in some cases hundreds of hours even, of narrative and video and things like this to back the game up, right? These games are costing $200 million over a few years. And that doesn't even include marketing costs, right? Now, why would you spend $200 million? You're not spending it because you're throwing the money down the drain. You're spending it because the cost of making a game has grown exponentially over the years. And it's grown because what you can do has grown exponentially. The technology has grown. The complexity has grown. And as it has grown, so too has the demand on the people making games. So whereas you could have a team 20 years ago, 10 years ago, which might have been 40 or 50 people, and a lot of them were generalists. So they would say, I am a game coder, programmer. They're also called like engineers and whatever, right? Or I am a game designer, or I am a game producer, or whatever. These people were generalists. They could do a lot of different things. And you could have a tight team around you where you all knew you could help each other. And they call that these days T-shaped, right? To say you're T-shaped. You're not just a vertical. You can do lots of different things. So you're T-shaped. However, as making a game has become ever more difficult, one of the factors that has made it more difficult is that we have advanced so much with technology that we can create these incredible visual feasts and story feasts and gameplay feasts. But the cost of that for a person trying to get into the games industry is that there is a tendency to become more and more specialized. And this specialism means that some of us are much rarer and harder to find than others. I'm pretty easy to find, right? I'm a bit of a generalist still. But in terms of specialisms, have a think about, well, okay, I'm making a game. It's a multiplayer game. It's a massively multiplayer game. That means hundreds of people can play it. It's an open world, massive multiplayer game. That means that thousands and millions of people can play it. And, oh, actually, I wonder what we need to hire to do that. Well, one of the people you need to hire is going to be someone who understands about online multiplayer. And then another person needs to understand not just online multiplayer, but the security issues behind it. Another person might need to understand the cloud programming and server and infrastructure world around that. And in fact, that whole area might need 3 people who really understand it. I remember reading, you've got an example down here of Horizon, the game called Horizon Forbidden West, and it's called other things as sequels have come out. But I remember games like this, which are huge open world games. I remember a team was, I think it was for the first one of these actually, the Horizon ones, where there was a team that was just making clouds. And there were 4 of them. And those 4 people spent 3 years working on clouds in the sky and making them look good. And indeed, in a lot of these games these days, clouds look really good, especially at sunset and sunrise. And how are they making them look that good? They have a team of people whose life revolves for years around making clouds. A good example is water as well. You know, as we've become more and more technically capable to make these incredible photorealistic games, entire teams of people are just sat there making water look good, right? Swimming underwater like here is a difficult thing to do. Now, even until quite recently, this sort of stuff wasn't really possible. We had a real history that you can go back and look at of the progress that's happened. And a lot of this progress has happened because people have worked on developing the technology and releasing what they call middleware, or things like Unreal Engine or Unity and others, in which you can purchase a big complicated bit of software and it does a load of the work for you. But it does a load of that work for you at a cost. And the cost is you have to learn how to use it. And again, it's so vast and complicated now and touches so many different areas that you have to have specialists hired to understand, for example, audio. So we have an audio lead at the moment who understands audio tech. And audio tech could be, for example, how do I use the Unreal Engine itself to properly utilize audio in a way that is this sort of three-dimensional sound that's so incredible, and etc., etc. But then just do that, an audio engineer does so much more. And we have specialists in, for example, user experience and user interfaces, and particularly in VR. How do you make interacting with objects and interacting with panels and being able to have menus and things like that, like you do in traditional games? How do you do that in VR? How do you do it in a way that isn't going to break the immersion, let's say, of a game, or isn't going to give you a bad user experience? And so there's entire areas where people spend years learning the craft of how to do this stuff. It's important to look at where we start from, right? When you make a game at the moment, and this is an example I've had from another game, you usually start with this game idea and this vision, and you might have like a design document, and your design document might be, in the past, could have been hundreds and hundreds of pages of design documentation. These days we tend to be more fluid, and we tend to recognize the fact that design can actually change quite a lot when you actually go from paper to something real. Here's an example of a design document that we had in a previous game that I worked on. And here we had things like, based upon the game vision, it was like, well, here's how the combat should probably look. And there were lots and lots of discussions and notes and some basic, like, oh, we're going to need immersive, stylish physicality. We're going to need gunplay-centric action. And it was like, how are we going to do all of those things? Fluid character movement. In this case, it's because we had cats. And it was like just discussions around that sort of thing. And a whole lot of discussion happens. And you use examples from different games, these inspirations from different games, and these uninspirations, these dispirations, in this case, of what we don't want it to be like. And people spend a lot of time, especially in design and at this sort of senior biz level, of like, well, what should this game look like? And what kind of game system should we be looking at? And who's our core audience? And you do all this work, right? And you come up with this overall vision, this overall like, hey, let's bring the team together and just talk around this vision, so we're all on board. This is the game that we're making, okay? And once you've done that, you might focus the vision down to say, like in this example, we went through the game and we said, well, okay, if we've got a cat in a game, how are we going to make this work? So, we probably want to be able to run along walls sideways, and we probably want to do, being able to do blah, 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 doesn't matter. But there was all these ideas, right, of, well, there's the big game vision, but what are we going to do first that's going to prove the game out? So we're going to focus on this piece to prove the game out. Okay, so proving the game out involves a smaller team having a go, trying stuff out. And this is often called something like a prototype, or maybe even a proof of concept. This idea that you're proving the game out. You're going, yeah, actually this could work. And you can go into more or less levels of detail. But basically, making a game these days, if we focus down on something here, is it involves having to think about lots and lots of different things, including what's your target audience, okay? Have we done any competitive analysis? Have we talked about what platform the game's going to go out? Have we done a marketing pitch thoughts? Have we got this game vision that I just showed you here? And have we got what are called these game pillars and key features that we'll come back to? What's innovative about the game? What's our unique selling points? What about the gameplay? Like, what's the first few minutes of the game look like? What's the flow of the game? What's the victory in game goals? How many players is it for? What kind of modes are we encouraging here? And how's it going to look? So let's do some art concepting. Let's have and this is where concept artists come in. Let's look at just artists having a go, just based upon the game vision, based upon the discussions that they're involved in. Have a go at generating just some ideas, just some concepts. And then let's talk about the art style. So you'll often have art directors going, hey, based upon the game vision and us all working together, we're building a kind of a few style ideas that we're going to hone down. And then we'll have an art style document, perhaps, with lots of examples. It doesn't have to be a document. And what about art pipelines? Because art's incredibly complicated. One of the most complicated things, and we'll come back to this, but how are we going to make the art? What the face is going to look like? What's the workflow going to be? How are we going to interact with the other teams to give them what they want when they want it? And tech. So do we have, for example, a physics game requirement or not? Do we have platforms that we yet to know that we're going to have to deliver on? And if so, what's the tech constraints and opportunities? How can we do things better than we thought we were going to do? Or is the platform quite old and we're going to have to constrain our ideas? And that comes down to engines used as well. And what's the team going to look like, of course, in all these cases? Production. So what about the planning? What about the recruitment? What about capacity planning? What about what are we going to do if, say, we're a remote studio? How are we going to communicate? How are we going to build the infrastructure for the different teams? How are we going to scope out what all these ideas that are coming together look like? And this is just in the first few months of making a game, right? That this sort of stuff's being tried out, talked about, etc. There's marketing, communications, reach discussions that may happen sooner or later. In the game I've worked on before, this game, particular one, we were working with the knowledge that we had to build up a fan base and build up publicity very early on. So that was something that we were doing as game developers. We were working in concert with our marketing teams and our publishing teams because they had to build up a fan base for us. And that's something that's become very normal, particularly with building up, say, Kickstarter, where you're looking for funding to come into you from a fan base. And we don't really do that here. We might have funds coming in from, say, Meta or from PlayStation or from whoever else, and we might part fund the game ourselves. But it means that we have to be thinking to ourselves, well, what's our involvement with marketing and communications and reach, etc.? What's our involvement with that? We're not just an isolated team, right? We all work together. Talking of teams, so the design team, when we're at the beginning of a game, say we've got combat, they're going to have to start thinking about the weapon mechanics. So what are the different weapons? How are they going to work? What about abilities? Are we going to have abilities? Are there going to be characters with abilities? If so, what kind of abilities? And how's it going to all come together, and et cetera, et cetera? And what about the different kinds of content and the levels, if there are levels? So if you look at our recent game Synapse, this is based on a certain idea that's an overall idea that's used quite a lot across different games at the moment, where you're going to go out and you're probably at some point going to die and have to start again, have another go, die, start again, have another go. And each time you learn more and you experience more and you get closer to the end of the game by this loop, right? So that's a particular kind of game, and it's a particular, it comes with particular ways of doing things and particular learnings of what works, what doesn't work when you're trying to do that sort of thing. And you have to build that in as a design team. You have to understand that and build that into the way you do things. And every game's different, right? And you can experiment and try different things. Is there player versus player? Is it player versus environment? If so, what about NPCs, non-player characters? What about the use of AI? So the games industry has been using AI for years. It's become a hot topic at the moment. But you know, the idea of using AI to say how enemies are going to react to your presence. Are they going to react? Are they going to be able to spot you very quickly? Are you going to be able to sneak past them? Do they walk from point A to point B to point C regularly? And you can track that if you're a player. Like, what are they going to do? Are they going to talk to you? And if so, what's that flow of communication going to look like? All of these are the sort of things where design teams become more and more specialist over time as the opportunity to do this becomes more and more enormous. So in one game, say The Witcher 3, The Witcher 3 is renowned for having hundreds of hours of missions and main gameplay in which you can go off and talk to people in the game who are these non-player characters and have these experiences and do these little quests. And it's renowned for each of these little side quests being incredibly interesting and important and exciting. Well, it takes hundreds of people to do that. UI and UX. So if we have, for example, like I mentioned this briefly before, but the user interface. So how do you interact with your own abilities, let's say, or choosing weapons or choosing dialogue options? How does that work? What does this HUD here, this heads-up display, what does that look like if you've got one? How do you know how many bullets you've got left in your gun? How do you know that you can actually go and grab something and pick it up? How's that interaction going to work? there's overlaps here with different areas of design and gameplay, but this user interface, user experience world requires specialists. Narrative, economics, it goes on, right? This is not limitless. But even things like game economy, how are you going to be rewarded? What's the cost of buying things? How are you going to get currency? Is there currency? How are you going to get rewarded in the game? What are those loops of effort, risk, reward? And these massively influence a game to the point of it can fail completely if the economics isn't thought through properly. And the same with the narrative, right? It's like, what kind of narrative do we want? Is there any narrative? And if there is, how rich is it? How different is it? How is it tied into, say, quests, if there are quests, or storyline or dialogue? Again, the bigger games become, and the hundreds and hundreds of hours, perhaps in some cases, of game experience. I mean, we're normally mid-tier games are normally looking like 2 to 6 hours, but the AAAs with the big budgets, they go much more than that. And then looking at the art team. So an art team has to consider, well, we can do concept art for you, and we can start looking at bits and pieces for you around, say, combat art, right? Combat and game content and tech and animation and VFX. So VFX is like special effects, visual special effects. But we need to know how you're designing this game, right? And we need to know your progress in the game. We need to know, and I'm talking about the you as in usually these design type teams working together with others to try things out, right? But we need to know, like, at what point is the game going to be, if you will, solid enough in that we've tested and we're happy that this is the sort of game we're definitely going to be making, that we can actually sign off on our art style and we can start making loads and loads of objects. And first, we might make objects which are just grey boxes, literally grey box. You'll hear that. And over time, we need to start adding more and more detail to those. And we need to start adding more and more detail to levels or worlds or whatever, right? You might start with a weapon which is just a grey rectangle. But over time, that needs to become the most badass mofo Vorpal sword in the universe that somebody lusts over, right? But there's no point making it that on day one, because on day one, you just need a grey rectangle, because on day 100, you might decide you're not going to have Vorpal swords, right? So you need to... Art in particular has this very, very long, complex workflow based upon how well or badly we're doing in other areas, or how many decisions we've been able to make, etc., etc. So it's extremely complicated. And these artists as well have become more and more specialized. And we're quite used now to hiring, say, environment artists. And then not just hiring environment artists, but say hiring hard surface environment artists, or special effect artists, or even tech artists or animation experts. Because everything you do in, say, the games we make, they're going to have animation support. So it doesn't just come for free. Now, a lot of the time, again, the kind of these engines that we use to help us do some of the work for us, but you still need that person there to go, well, I'm going to make this look incredible. And you need that. And so on and on and on. And engineering. So our coders, our programmers, the engineering teams as well. Here they are with their different ways of doing things. And it depends on the sort of game you're making. Here, there's an example where I've put in some crypto, blockchain and web stuff. But, you know, in our sort of games, we don't really do that. We may have gameplay engineers who are working on mechanics and skills and weapons. And they might be sitting alongside system designers who are working on how the overall system of the game is going to fit together in the way that everything interacts. We might have world and narrative engineers helping to put together the world and the narratives, right? How the narrative system itself, etc. We might have, and we will probably almost always have, these sort of networking type engineers who are working with us on the matchmaking. So when you're trying to say, I've come along to play a competitive game and I want to be matched against people that I'm going to feel like I can have a fair chance against. So it's that kind of thing. Online, massive, right? Online. So the online piece around cloud deployments and databases, engine work. A lot of engineers work on the engine work and enjoy that very much, like the streaming, the graphics, the physics, etc. But even with things like audio and UI, you need technicians or engineers who can put that stuff into the game. And you can't, because otherwise you just create, like artists, right? You can't just have artists who are creating a load of things. The art needs to get into the game. So who's going to put it in, and how they're going to slot it all together? These are where these engineers come in to help you. And that includes even work on tools and with pipelines and things like this. Okay. Now, that's just the beginning. And once you begin to understand that, you have to also understand that each of the areas have people who are going into these enormous amounts of detail. For example, here we have people just thinking about different kinds of audio interactions, and we have like huge amounts of work being done there, and we can branch out and look at, for example, level design conversations around how are we going to do level design, what are the different phases, how do we go from this sort of grey box world of trying a few things out to really the architecting and the finishing. And all of this is tied in, never in isolation. All these different teams have to tie that into the overall level of confidence that's being built up around making a game. And that's what I want to go into next. And let's have a look at this, just so we're using the same terminology to help understand the conversation that I'm having with you. I've mentioned maybe like the game vision and things like that, right? The overall game. But there's some important things that where you might hear about, like game pillars, game mechanics, and the game loop, right? And you don't need to understand all of this stuff now because your brain will melt. But it's fairly easy to get your head around some of it, right? So say you may have heard of a game called Diablo, you might not. But Diablo has these pillars, and it's visually represented here, right, as pillars holding up Diablo 3. So holding up the game for Diablo 3 are approachable, powerful heroes, highly customizable, great item game, endlessly replayable, strong setting, and a cooperative multiplayer. So those are its main pillars. So if you look at things like endlessly replayable, it's saying one of the signs of success for our game is that you can endlessly replay it without getting bored. When it says things like powerful heroes, guess what? You can become one. Great item game. So Diablo itself as an IP is renowned for collecting items and collecting more and more powerful items to the point of it's just ridiculous. You know, you can collect thousands and thousands of these things, and it's become something that's popular across loads of other games now as well. But these are pillars. So what it means is they are they're the pillars upon which the game sits. So if you're a designer, you can look at those pillars and say, is what I am doing now going to contribute to these game pillars, or is it not? And you can start making priority decisions around that as well. Like, well, it's not really one of our core pillars, but we can have a go at this, or, well, we're going to have a go. You know, we're running out of time, we're running out of money. We're going to have to look at our pillars and maybe cut out an entire pillar that's important to us, but we just don't have the time or the money to make it happen. Or maybe we're in negotiation with a client and they say, well, you're saying here cooperative multiplayer. To be honest with you, we've only got half the budget you need. I think you're going to have to get rid of multiplayer and just do a single player version. Yeah, it's things like that, right? That can happen. And there's different examples here of, say, The Last of Us, which you may have heard of. It's now a TV show, right? The zombie game, human survival game, The Last of Us. So crafting, story, AI partners. So building a relationship between the player's character with the AI partners you meet. Stealth. Stealth's a good one. Stealth comes up a lot in a lot of games. Being able to sneak around normally means you can sneak around so you can slaughter people in peace and quiet. But, you know, there's other things too. And so let's have a look at Spider-Man. Guess what? And this is now a core mechanic. So a mechanic, right, is something that it's not a theoretical pillar. It's something you actually use in the game. It's an actual mechanic. So, for example, in Spider-Man, it was incredibly important that you got to swing with your web. You need to go and go swinging. And that was a game mechanic. And if they didn't get that right, it would just ruin and trash the entire game. Because you knew if you were Spider-Man, you had to be able to do that. And if you think about it, it's a very difficult thing to do. If you want to be able to swing really fast in loads of different places and change direction a lot, most people are just going to throw up if you don't do that properly, right? So it was that kind of thing. And there's a lot of that, those core game mechanics. You see it a lot in some of the old Mario games or the new Mario games. Some of the real classic older games and how they've developed over time. They had like one or two core mechanics, and you can build an entire game around those mechanics. Game loops are just, defeat the enemy, get a reward, you might level up. You defeat more enemies, you get bigger rewards, you level up. Those are like your game loops. Now, the reason I show you that is because when you're making a game, you might have a core mechanic, right? Now, that core mechanic, say, if you're Spider-Man, or in the case of Synapse, there are some core mechanics, right? Like being able to manipulate objects with your left hand and throw them around and grip them and make them explode, etc. And on your right hand, you've got the weapon. So you could argue you've got some core mechanics there, right? But around those core mechanics, you need to have your core pillars. And you might understand some of your core pillars. So here in this diagram, I've kind of said, as an overall architectural plan for the game, you might have some core pillars you understand, and you might have some you haven't yet really had the chance to nail down and properly understand, okay? And for your core pillars, you might say, well, what are the systems and the mechanics and the requirements? What's the art workflow and requirements? And you might have some questions around that, right? And like, we need to have a go. We need a little bit of time. Give us some time to have a go. Now, I want to pause now because this is so important that up here in this area here, there are things like core game loops, core pillars, like features that come out of that you want to make. But there's a whole area here of knowns and unknowns at the very beginning of a game in which you know that some things are working for you, but you really need to be able to have the time to explore. And this is absolutely vital if you work with the games teams, because planning a game, you cannot plan a game from A to B to C and say that will take me 6 weeks. And our game will come out in 3 months' time because we're going to do this, then we're going to do that, and then we're going to do that, and then we're going to ship it. Like, no, you're not. And this is what makes making games so unique. You are being given the opportunity to explore and fail and to eradicate bad options and to explore and discover new opportunities that until you put some of these different things that you're trying out together, you didn't even understand the possibilities. A lot of the best games develop over time through trial and error, through having a core idea, but being given the chance to explore that idea and to explore all these different things around it. That's incredibly important to understand because it means you cannot rely on a short to medium term plan of action as the gospel truth. Because if someone said to you, oh yeah, we'll have done that in 3 months' time and we're exploring all these different things and we're hoping that in 3 months' time that's something that will be there, you got to take that and go, well, but it might not be, right? Could take 4 months, could take 2, because you've got to be able to fail. You're experimenting. So the way that games teams these days are put together, they tend to be put together across different disciplines of, say, design, engineer, and art, put together to work on a few things and to try a few things out. So they'll own maybe they'll own a pillar of different features and they'll be trying them out and seeing if they work. But at some point, that's all got to come together into a single game. And it might come together, for example, in a single level. Let's say you make one level as a test level so you can try things out within that. But you might bring it all together and the designers in particular, the lead designers, might come together and go, oh God, that doesn't work at all. Or they might say, we're onto something here. Let's throw all our effort into this thing here. Well, let's go off on a tangent. Let's explore, because that could be the next big thing. And that's what making a game's all about. You're not making a mobile app. You're not making a piece of software, right? You're not saying it's the next version of Microsoft Excel. Oh, look, we have to add this, this, and this and fix these bugs. You're not doing that. You're exploring something which with a bunch of experienced people around you as well as new people, right? There's a bunch of inherent knowledge there. There's a bunch of not having to reinvent the wheel. There's a bunch of understanding what works and doesn't work, particularly in the VR space, where you can make people very sick very quickly, and you can make them feel like, why on earth are you doing this to me? Because you don't understand some of the core elements of virtual reality games and what you need and need not do. That's why you have those experts around you, but you also need the time and the people around you who can push out an experiment and come up with something truly brilliant. And often these things just occur because you're trying a few combinations out and it just clicks. And often it doesn't click and you have to get rid of it. So you could therefore be designing, say, a great weapon and a great idea of how to use this weapon, and it might be a brilliant idea, but it doesn't fit in with the rest of the game. So you end up dumping it, or you end up putting it to one side and coming back to it in a different game even, right, over time. So this variability makes making a game complex and complicated. You cannot simply put a plan together that goes, we'll spend 2 months doing X, we'll spend 2 months doing Y, we'll spend 2 months doing Z. It's like, no, what we will do is we'll split making a game into different stages of exploration in which the foundations at the beginning are not set in concrete. They're not set in stone, right? They are still very fluid. We're trying things out. Now, of course, we do have a budget and we do have a number of people and we do have to have some kind of plan. But within these phases, especially at the early days of making a game, you must have a lot of play there. You must have a lot of room to play around and mess about and try things out. Now, of course, if you look here, you also have your core systems that you're working on right in the background. So you might have a whole bunch of things to do, engineers that just need to do things that you just need to do. So if you're going to be multiplayer, so if lots of players are going to play your game all at the same time, there's just a whole bunch of core work you need to do, right, to prepare for that. But the intricacies of multiplayer, like, well, how many people, how many players, and what are they going to have to be able to do together? Are they just going to look at each other? Are they going to interact together? Are they going to cooperate with each other? Are they going to kill each other? Are they going to be able to stand on top of each other's shoulders? Are they going to be able to pass through each other? Is they going to, all that sort of stuff, right? A lot of that can come later. Not all of it, but a lot of it can come later as you explore and as you nail down what that game's going to be. But, if you have enough of a vision there of what the game's generally going to be, there's a lot you can do in advance. And a lot you must do in advance, because you have to be ready for when those phases are tighter and they're expecting you to go, right, now we're going to need you to give us that multiplayer that we said we'd need, right? So you're working closely with the different teams as time goes by, and you're communicating really tightly with each other to say, this didn't work, this did work. And that goes for lots and lots of different bits of the game, right? And then down here I've got things like the interfaces, the economic model, the KPIs that you might be having to, the metrics you might be measuring against them, and lots of other different things. But if we then sort of move on and look at what's known and what's not known, you can kind of make this model. You can make this model visually a little bit more pleasing and less chaotic by saying, well, okay, over time, we need to explore and discover and then reapply what we've learned for all these like not yet understood things, like maybe our core pillars, our game loops, until eventually we start having more and more that's understood. And that means that we're mostly confident, right? And we have this foundation work and we have this prep work we can do. So some of this stuff's low risk and well understood. Some of it can be worked on, developed over time. It's not so critical. But then this stuff over here, we just have to try, okay? What we all have to understand is that the foundation work can still change, right? It's not absolutely set in stone yet. It could influence us right down here working on our tech art setups and our core systems. We should expect it. So I say here, expect changes and cries for help. But over time, there are fewer and fewer requests for help and fewer interruptions, if you will, where you say to the engineer working on core systems, stop working on the core system, please come and help us on this. Less and less of that happens over time because you become more and more confident, right? So up here, these unknowns, where you're asking all these questions about what's the impact on other systems if we do this thing? What about what's going to happen when we reach like the live game? What's going to happen about UI? What's going to happen about art? As time goes by, it's like you gain more and more confidence, okay? And it reduces what appears to be complete chaos at the beginning. As that chaos is controlled, and I won't bother going into Scrum and stuff like that, but eventually you kind of settle down with this sort of a blueprint, right? This blueprint that goes, okay, so overall we now understand a lot. And in fact, some of these core game loops we do understand, but we're not going to use them because there are like no chance. Some of them, we just love them, and we're going to put more effort into these things than we thought we would initially. And sometimes we're going to say, well, yeah, we do understand this core pillar, but we're going to have to fix it because we've worked on a bunch of other things we know now. We're going to have to like actually go back to it and fix it. And some of this stuff is like a definite, like, please, we must have these things, and we love these things, but we're not going to have these things. So you learn that over time, right? And it will affect, to a degree, your vision. And it will certainly affect your design piece as well, in which some things get removed, some things get more emphasis, etc. And the same goes for your core systems and things down here where you're like, oh, actually, you know what, our economic model, now that we have a much better idea of what we're doing, we've kind of gone off in a different direction. We're going to have to change our economic model. And it's fine, right? Because again, with big complex games, and we do make big complex games, that's just the way it is. You have to say, you know, we're not just copying and pasting, we're discovering. And then as we discover, we're becoming more and more solid in our belief, our confidence that we found what we wanted to find, or that we found something completely new. And so that can lead to things like our vision and design being more honed, being able to write down our, I call them Bibles here, like art Bibles and guides, reducing the need for change, right? Reducing the level of uncertainty, gives us that whole perspective, and a shared team understanding. So the whole team's been working together, right, to understand what is the game ahead, and why we've made certain decisions has been communicated the whole time. At least that's the best way of doing it. And new horrors have come up, so things that really don't work, things where we're going, oh my God, no, right? This is the time to discover that stuff near the beginning. Now, the beginning could be a month, 3 months, a year. It depends on the scale of the game, right? And you know, it will never stop discovering new horrors as we go along. Things that scare the bejesus out of us and go, oh God, we promised this, but oh my God, how are we going to do it? We might have to go and renegotiate this because it's so hard. And, or, you know, we're going to need more time, more money, or we're just going to not be able to do it at all. If we do this, it's going to have a massive dependency and impact on these other things. That is just the way it is. Because we are pushing boundaries, right? We're trying to make a game that no one's made before on a lot of occasions. We might be copying a lot. We might be copying things that have worked for us before. We might be copying what we know is very popular out there in the market at the moment. But still, we're trying to put something out there which will be unique and brilliant enough that people want to buy our game, right? And not some other game, or buy our game as well as other games. They need to be able to go, yeah, you know what? That's awesome. You've got great game reviews. It's our kind of game. We definitely want to have a go at this. Take our cash. Reveals new opportunities as well. And at this point, we're much more able to plan the hell out of it. In other words, we're much more able to be confident now of the scope of the game and the scale of work ahead of us and the order of things that we want to do things in. Okay? So we can start having a much more confident view of the plan. And that comes about over time. You can't write a plan on day one. You can write a plan and it will be total rubbish, because unless you are really helicopter view, right? I mean, you can have a plan that goes, we're going to do this for 3 months, and then we're going to do that for, I don't know, maybe a year. And then we're going to do roughly this sort of stuff for like another year. And you're like, yeah, okay, that's pretty high level. That's cool. But the more detail you try and gather, and the more you delve into the detail, the wronger you're going to be until you've got this sort of stuff worked out. Yeah? There's no point saying, Oh yeah. Day one, I've worked out that the art team's going to have to be making all of these things. You're like, well, hang on, it's day one, is it? Because you could dump an entire pillar or a game mechanic or an entire area of the game or 30 levels. Like that, you cannot nail this stuff down on day one. So it can get really, really complicated as well because you're dealing with interactions, right? Now, if I just skip over to this one. So if we skip over to an example of where I've worked with teams before. So what we've done is I've worked with leads and directors to have this view of, well, what do we need to do now? What do we need to do next? And what do we need to do later? Okay. And it's based upon reaching certain milestones. So like, yeah, we want to prove out the concept. So a proof of concept. We want to, when is that going to be? And what do we need to do to be able to do that? And by department or areas of departments, so say the design-led areas of, say, characters, weapons and equipment, game mode, economy and systems, right? Audio, UI, UX, engineering-led, so the foundational game systems, game networking, cross-functional Cortex, online, DevOps, web, QA, studio setup, IT, security, maintenance and support, massive amounts of pipeline, workflow and tools work that needs to be done in every game. Creative department, so art pipelines and outsourcing, narrative story development, gameplay, different types of gameplay, maybe virtual world, we don't do those here, audio, creative direction, live service, cinematics and trailers, marketing, communications, reach, user research. Okay, all this stuff. We haven't even talked much about the marketing side at all. But all of this stuff has all these lines of dependencies flashing by, right? And you need to talk about all these different things with each other, and you need to plan them all out, which is why producers and project managers need to work so carefully and hard with in collaboration with the different teams. But say you want, say, I don't know, let's have a look at audio. You don't work audio in isolation. You have to understand the systems and framework you're going to be using and how it's going to plug in. You have to work on, you got weapons? Well, okay, let's look at the SFX for that, and base characters and dialogues and UIs and music and ambient audio systems and all these different things, right, that you need to make decisions about and invest in. Weapons and equipment, characters. If you look at the characters, you need to be able to do things like, well, how's the camera going to be set up, and what's the base character going to be, and how are we going to tie that in with, say, producing however many we've got to make of these things. We need to test it out one, and then we can roll out more. How long is that going to take? And in order for that to happen, what other things are we going to have done first to have supported that happening? And that might come down to things like animation logic foundation, right? Weapons and abilities, character class controls, camera frameworks, input systems, locomotion. None of which you need to know, but what you do need to understand that when you scroll out and you look at all of these interactions between different things, making a game is hellishly difficult. It's just so hard. And it's why it's so important that you hire and retain and train and support the people who are helping you do this. You lose one of these specialists who's the person who's in this little bit here of how everything comes together, and you're screwed. Right? It can take you a long time to find that person again. It can hold you up dramatically. So huge amounts of interrelated work where teams rely upon each other and work together so closely. You cannot do that in a vacuum of production planning. You can't do it in a vacuum of communication. You have to all be talking to each other. And of course, as this is going on and we're exploring the game and we're exploring, we're trying to nail down the kind of game we're making, we have to feed back to everybody else. And in non-game dev as well, like the skill set shortages, the hiring plans, how the budget's going to change, how we're going to have to swivel or pivot and some ideas, how some things are going to go away, which means we don't need some people anymore, or how some things have become far more important. So we're going to have to, say, outsource to get a load of people really quickly to fill some gaps that we've got. This stuff develops over time, and it's why it can appear very chaotic. Now, if we look at some of the things that you do when you're making a game, there are some sort of set phases that they're useful to think about, right? They're not always that true. Now, again, I'm using another game example here, but you start with the game concept, right? And you build confidence in that as you go. And maybe in our case, we had to build out some fanatic or fans, but in your case, you might not need to. Or in our case, maybe we do, maybe we don't. But it's a bit mental. It's exciting and chaotic at this point, right? You're trying a lot of things out. And you're writing a lot of stuff down. You're trying a lot of things out. You're rapid prototyping, as they say. You're just trying. Does this work? Does that work? Like I was saying to you, pre-production is when you're a little bit more prepared, right? You're beginning to build up this view of, this is the kind of game we're making here. These are the kind of things we're exploring. We're beginning to get a much better idea, and you go, holy crap, there's a lot to do, right? Let's dig in, let's get on with it. So let's prove out our concept, and let's do things like put together things like our visual style and art bibles. Let's prove out some of our pipelines of how things should work, in what order, and how they relate to different teams, and how we all need to work together. And a lot of that you can do from your experience of working on other games, right? Which is why experience is so important. But some things are always going to have to be specific to your game, specific to your tool sets, specific to the people, specific to X, Y, and Z. But, it's trying to look at some things like, hey, what's the overall story art looking like? What about the core game loops? What about these big lists of assets we can start building? As we become more confident, we can indeed go back to, say, art and be much more confident that we need, say, 1,000 objects of this kind, or 16 enemy bosses, or 12 different types of level biomes, as they call them, of different types, in which you can become more confident that you know how many objects to create, or how many animations you're going to need, or what kind, and how complex and how difficult, and at what level of quality, right? More higher and higher quality, of course, as you go along, and how to slot that back into the game. And what you'll find is that you become more confident in predicting that, and then you can start doing things like outsourcing, etc. Now, you might at this point go, well, hang on, we were given so many million to make this game, and after having now looked at what we do know, and out these big lists of, say, art assets we're building out, and etc., we've taken a fresh look at when we're supposed to be ready by, roughly, if we know such a thing, or when we're going to run out of money because we've spent it all. And we've realised we're going to have to rescope the game, right? So, in other words, we were thinking we were going to be making, let's say, 100 levels, if it's that sort of game, but we're only going to be able to afford to make 50. So now we have to go back and we need to talk about that. So we need to go and talk to our, to the team and to the bosses, etc. What does that mean? What's the implication? If we have a client who's expecting 100 and we can only do 50, what does that mean, right? And this is where the role of some of the more senior people in the games team, and how they can explain this to, if we have clients, external clients, how they can work that out. This is where their jobs become much harder. And often you might look in from the outside, and just because you're not gone through the, how can I put it, the variability, right, that comes with making a game, that you might look in on that and go, well, why didn't you know that from the start, right? You just overpromised. And you're like, well, no, we didn't. What we said was that from what we know, and with the amount of money we've been given, and from the little bit of investigation that we've done at the very beginning of this, through our pitch team and maybe through a little bit of concept work, we're fairly confident that this should be okay. But actually, because we've now started, we've realised that we don't even need 100 levels. In fact, we can do a much better job with 50 levels. And in fact, the duration of the game is going to be even longer than it was going to be with 100 levels, because of what we've learned and how we're doing things differently. And actually, because we're putting a much bigger amount of our effort into, say, AI enemies, or because we've realised that this is less a traversal game of moving around and more a combat game, we just, it's a different kind of experience now. And we've agreed with the client, or we're talking to the client about this, and, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to realise that it's a changing story, right? That And the changing story isn't because of any kind of incompetence or dishonesty. It's in fact the opposite of that. It's the exploration, and it's part of the joy of making a game, that you are exploring and discovering and pivoting. And yeah, sometimes it does mean you're going to have to go and say, look, we just need more time and more money if you want it to be this thing. And then that's a negotiation, right? And often you get more money and more time, and often you don't. And then you have to decide, well, what we're going to do with this. I mean, I'll give you an example. There was a game I worked on where I was put in charge of a budget and a schedule, and I was told, here's your game, go and make that. And I inherited the plan, and worked out we were going to be 2.5 years late. So that was a case of going to, the leadership team and the clients and going, right, well, do you want to be 2.5 years late? And if not, what are we going to do about it? And we ended up dropping a bunch of pillars. We ended up dropping a bunch of the real advanced tech we wanted to use. We ended up having to do things differently, and we ended up having to reuse a whole bunch of levels and reuse them in clever ways. So it was that kind of stuff, right? That you need to be quite fluid around the fact that sometimes things will go wrong or things will go right in areas that you weren't expecting. That's game development. And, some of the complexity of the tech that you're using and some of the problems that come up you would never expect. And these could even come down to, you've designed your game, you thought about it, you've got an economic model, you've gone and talked to the legal department. The legal department have said, you do realise, right, that this thing here that you're trying to do is going to cost us a lot of money, because we're going to have to look at this from the legal perspective and do X, Y, and Z, right? Or you could look at, say, the amount that you have to pay as a percentage to, say Epic, who own Unreal Engine, you want to use it, and you've negotiated a certain percentage, and there's lots that could change subtly the decisions that you make. And it's not all about the design of a game or what's happening on the ground. Some of it comes from above, right? Some of it's in that sort of that cloud above of business, and we might be making the most amazing game in a certain type of game, in a certain arena of game, and then discover that actually somebody else has just brought out the same game that we are working on and has rendered our game really non-competitive, and we've got to pivot. We've got to decide what to do about that. So we're in a competitive market, and we're trying to compete for attention and money and time, and tear people away from other games to play our game. So there's a lot there that's going on all at the same time. And so, surprisingly, I'm sure some clients don't want to give you an endless supply of money, or they might even end up deciding to give you half the amount of money you'd agreed you were going to get. And these sort of things, right, they happen all the time, because game making is both a kind of should be really a joy, but it's also a business. So, things happen in business. So once you've got your game pre-production is once you've got that kind of you've done a whole bunch of prep work, if you will, to say, we are now confident that we can just forge on and just get on with it and make the game, right? Let's go. That's when you enter game production, full-on production. And these are movie producer sort of terminologies, right, for concepts. But a game production phase means, I like to say, it's like you're on the conveyor belt, right? You're just doing a whole bunch of stuff over and over again. If you're, say, an artist, you might be told, go and make 300 of these things, and off you go, right? And no one's interested in you doing that to an incredibly creative degree every time. What they're interested in is, can you do that, say, 200 or 300 times slightly differently each time, or, and it just depends, right, on what you've been asked to do. And the level of quality and the finish of quality, etc., you might need to do it to a certain level of quality and stop, because it could still be that during production some of that gets dumped, some of it's not used, right? And people need it at certain points, at a certain level of quality, so they can put it into a game level, let's say, that they're working on, and see if it even works, or and then feed back to you. There's a huge amount of feedback going on during game production as well, up and down, left and right, all over the place. And that's vital, Again, it's the team working together. But it's also a bit of a conveyor belt, frankly. If you're a game level designer, I keep going on about levels. Some games don't have levels, but let's assume they do. But if say you're a game level designer in which your entire job is making levels, and you have to try and make each level unique enough to be interesting, you're not just making a level to test players and make it difficult for them to survive a level, let's say. You might be making levels where each different level is teaching the player like a new game mechanic that you've introduced and a new enemy that you've introduced. And there's a huge amount of skill and learnings and experience that go into doing that in a way that keeps the player interested and keeps them excited, but doesn't just drive them away by being too frustrating, or doesn't just drive them away by being too easy, right? There's like huge amounts going on here. So a lot of this is, again, constant communication, which is where producers are so important to be making sure that's happening and to help with, again, like narrowing down that planning as you develop the game. So lots and lots and lots of going on here during production, right? The meat on the bone is what I've said there. And you really need to care about people during game production, because there is a tendency to just work and work and work and work and work. And you need to remember, we have a game vision. Are we keeping to that game vision? And we have end goals, right? We have like, we're going somewhere. We need to keep reminding the people who are working on this thing that, there's more to life than just work. Like, and that's where you'll find things like show and tells, where we'll stop and show ourselves our progress. We'll show the whole team, like, here's how we're doing. Here's what because sometimes if you're working over there in, I don't know, environment art, and you're working over there in back-end engineering, you might not have a clue what the bigger picture's looking like. So like every week or every 2 weeks or every month, you might all stop and go, hey, let's all come together and show each other different bits of the game that we're working on, and show the overall progress. And it's so important. Keeps you realizing you're part of a team, part of a game, right? Particularly if you're working remotely and you never even meet each other apart from with, say, quarterly gatherings. So anyway, all of this stuff happens, and eventually you start doing things like play testing, in which you get it in front of a lot of people to have a go at, and you then take the feedback from them and you assess it, and you might make some changes to the game as a result. And then you might start rolling it out to, say, geographical regions of the world. So you might choose a country where there's not many people and try it out there, like roll it out there and give them access to it and see what they think. And then again, you might decide, well, before we go fully live, let's make a few more tweaks because we've exposed some bugs or some imbalances in the game economy, or some imbalances in, say, weapons or something, right? Bear in mind, you might have only tested it on friends and family before then. So you might not be that confident, right? You need to try it on more and more and more people. But eventually the game does go live, which means it's gone out to everybody, right? They're now, and you might have rolled it out over time. You might have sold it, right? You might have gone, right, done, there you go, game's ready, sell it. But even then, although in the old days, the oldie days, right, before you were born in the 1980s and things like that, you'd ship a game on a cassette and it would be done, right? Done. And up until relatively recently, you do things called like gold label and things like that, where, you print a CD or a DVD, right? Or whatever, right? You print the game out onto something physical and you sell it. Nowadays, yes, there's still the ability to do that for some games, but more and more and more, you're putting games onto services where you download the game to your computer or onto your headset or whatever, right? So you can do that through lots of different services like Steam and others, right? And there's no physical game at all. So that does mean that these days, because people are so used to downloading, that we have an opportunity to say, here's your game, and then as soon as you try and play the game, we get you to download something, and we call that like a day one patch, right? Where we fix a whole bunch more bugs, or we've added in a final feature, or we've tweaked something that we realised wasn't working. We've responded, right, to things that we've noticed in our testing before it went live, and we just get people to download something to fix all these things or to add this final bunch of features or capabilities, right? And that's nowadays almost always happening. So it gives you an opportunity, right, to introduce that kind of little bit more at the end. And then it's live. Hooray, the game's out. So say, in our case, say recently Synapse has just come out, right? So you start to get game reviews. Players are using it in large numbers, and you can start responding to their feedback, right? You can start saying, well, okay, maybe we need to put another patch out because we've realized there's this bug. We just didn't find this bug with this problem. We would never have found it, but somebody's done this stupid thing, and actually now people can what's called game the system, right? They can exploit something. They found a security weakness, let's say, or they found a way of making infinite currency or something like that, right? And we might need to do something about it. We might need to react. And so you're never fully finished on a lot of these games. You're working on them after they've gone and been sold to players, right? You're still doing things. And then there's an entire world where you go into this like live game and service, where you become a service, where they call it games as a service these days, where and things like that, where you can put out more and more content for the game even. So you can put out more and more levels or different characters, or you can, something that's really common is customize your character, buy objects, clothing, weapons, abilities, whatever, right? And depends on the sort of game. But a lot of games try and go on and on and on for years, and they keep putting out entire new parts of a world, let's say, or an entirely new character, let's say, that you can play in a fighting game or something, or whatever it is. So this world of making a game, you have to go, well, is it doing well? Has it sold well? Should we put some more content out? Should we maybe have a season pass where you buy a season pass, and as a result of that season pass, you get all this stuff, this extra stuff? Or should we just stop? Should we just say, oh, that's enough? Maybe we've put the game out and we've given them one bit of content to download, and we'll just stop now. We'll move on to something else. And you can have fewer and fewer and fewer of your original team helping to do this. You can even hand it over to like live events teams and live ops, live operations, in which they're really doing that for you. They're doing things like running events. Maybe it's Christmas and you do a special Christmas event, right? But you do need some people left. And also, the longer your game's out there and the bigger your game is, the more you're going to be exposed to, should we build some new features? Should we fix some bugs? And particularly important, do we need to balance the ecosystem? Because you will find, as you introduce more and more content, things go more and more wrong. Someone's always going to find a way to exploit something that you've put in. So you have to react to that, because otherwise, and this has happened a lot, you can lose literally millions of players in like a few weeks because something unbalanced the system, and now it's being exploited. And normal people, I'm going to say normal, but the majority of players might not exploit this thing, but some are exploiting it, and they've completely ruined the game experience for others. And you need to be able to respond to that really quickly. All of which is expensive, all of which means that you have to have people willing to still be working on a game while the rest of their team might be making another game. And so it's very complicated, right? We can't really predict that in the kind of games we're making for virtual reality. If you're making a mobile game, you tend to go out far quicker, and you tend to be able to respond far faster, because mobile games on the whole are a lot simpler and you can make changes a lot quicker, right? So, but with something like this, where we're putting out onto headsets, and different kinds of headsets with different kinds of capabilities, and maybe we're planning for a headset that's yet to even launch, and we want to support that and be a title launch for them, there's a lot of unknowns. And while we try through the services of, say, BizDev and publishing to predict how successful this game's going to be, and while we very much listen to what they tell us about, say, a core audience that we're aiming at, our target audience, and what we expect that target audience to enjoy or not enjoy, and we tweak our game towards those sort of things, it's very much still a guess, right? And that guess can be influenced by data, for sure. And what we tend to do these days is we have the capability to add in these hooks to a game in which we can watch the path that a player takes through our game, and we can see where they stop playing, for example, and we can go, oh, I think we've made that too hard. We better change that because people are getting to that point and then they're giving up. So we can put those sort of things into our game, and we can measure that data and visualize that data, and our design teams and others can sit there monitoring that and go, oh, look, there's a bug there because we can see people are going along that area and then they're just leaping across to there, but they shouldn't be able to. So we can use data in that to our advantage. But again, you're paying for that. You need people to be doing that for you. So in the background of making a game, there's also a bunch of work going on from the other teams, all of you, and it can include things like data collection and reporting, and it can include things like marketing and promotion, right? And finding the right people and looking at the legal loopholes and looking at the finances and supporting the entire team on a people level or a process level or even a program of products level. Lots and lots of different levels, right? Some of it might be development support from, say, shared services or core tech. Some of it might be the kind of support that the more senior people on a team might need around budgeting and legal advice and documentation. And there's these things called requirement checklists for people like Sony, right, and Meta, where they go, well, and you're not allowed to publish a game on PlayStation, for example, or PSVR, for example, or Meta headsets, until you've ticked all these check boxes of all these different requirements, and they won't even let you put your game out there, right, or even test it until you've done some of this stuff. So there's a huge amount of complexity now, and you really need to see it as a business, and as a huge platform. Any game now is like, there's so much out there that you need to be aware of, and all of you help us to do that. And if I zoom out, I mean, there's a bunch of other things I can show you about. Like, for example, this is a map someone drew up of these different phases, and these they've got here in terms of passes, because they're looking at, say, art passes and design passes and how it all influences each other. But it's just to show you, right, that this stuff's really complicated. And it's not because you have an artist trying to help a designer, or you have an engineer trying to help a team of designers and animators and whatever. It's because you have hundreds of people or dozens of people all helping each other. And the more people you have and the longer you have and the bigger your ambitions, the more complicated it is. We haven't even touched upon things like infrastructures to support all this stuff, right? So often you'll see that there'll be these teams of people who are just looking at dedicated servers and looking at how to set things up and configure and support for you so that you can go out live and support. I mean, you might have 100,000 players all at the same time on your servers, right? Are you ready for that? You might have one, but then it might go viral. And this has happened a lot. A game will go viral and will go completely beyond expectations. And suddenly, like this happened to a game called Fall Guys most recently, where they were expecting, maybe 10,000 players concurrently, so at the same time, and they ended up with hundreds of thousands. And whenever that happens, suddenly you find yourself pouring effort and money at your game servers to try and not to fall over. This stuff's unpredictable, right? You can't predict human nature. You can't predict if your game's going to be a hit or not. You can reduce the risks, and you can reduce the chaos around that, and the expectations can be controlled, and you can look at the data and you can do all of these sort of things. But that magic of has the game hit that sweet spot that enough people right now, that's the kind of game they want. That's where you're always going to have a risk, right? You can't mathematically predict it. And it's why a lot of mobile games are very simple, and they repeat successful game loops or game mechanics, and they just what's called reskin it. So they put different, like maybe graphics or stories or audio around it, and they're almost guaranteed that there's like a success to be had there. It's a more simplistic type of game that they're making on the whole. Not always, but on the whole. There's more and more of these diagrams of just like, oh my God, it's so hard. There's so much to do, right? But you'll see here, like, list of full-time staff required, and, things like patents, copyrights, trademarks, communications, deadlines, frameworks. It's so complex. And that's where you all help us, right? And we all help you. And the end result, of course, is that you're hoping for a successful game to go out. So, signups have just gone out, and it's currently around the 77-75% mark on Metacritic, which is an accumulator, an aggregator of game review scores. And we're hoping for big things, right? But, eventually we want our games to be like all 90s, etc. Well, for that to happen, we all need to work together smoothly. We all need to be supporting each other. We all need the right people in the right places, the right budgets, the right opportunities. And it's a really hard thing to do. That'll do for now, I think. I was going to show you this, which was an example of using the Unreal Engine to do one part of making a game and how it all interrelates and interacts. But I think you've got the picture already, right? Let me know what you think, and I hope this was useful. And I hope it explains why, to a certain degree, there's a level of chaos, why there's a certain lack of the... I think a good way of putting it is sometimes we just can't answer your questions. We can't give you a black and white answer to something. And, we don't like that. We don't like it. But it's great if you could understand that it depends on the phase of making a game. And it depends on if we've lost a really important person or we've had to pivot in a direction we weren't expecting. There's a lot of chaos around that. And sometimes we just need like a little bit of a pat on the shoulder and some understanding and maybe some donuts. And far more than going, well, surely you should be able to tell us what your hiring plan is. It can't have changed, right? I mean, you're making a game, you should know. But you're like, well, actually, yeah, we have a hiring plan, but actually we can now sit down with you and say it's changed because the game has changed to a certain extent. Or, we thought we were going to have to rely a lot more on this kind of role, but actually it's this kind of role we now realize we're going to have to rely on. So in fact, we're going to have skill set shortages in 6 months' time. Now, of course, that perfect world requires workflow, process, communication, the right people helping, etc. Right? So that's, again, back to the point, right? Is that it's hard, but we must see ourselves as one team making games together. And on that bombshell, I'm going to stop.